Welcome to the Voices for Change virtual tour. This webinar, Beyond Defunding, Engaging Community Partners Responding to Intimate Partner Violence, is brought to you from Texas with our presenting partners, Respond Against Violence, the Texas Forensic Nurse Examiners, and Project Beloved, the Molly Jane Mission. Today's guests include Kelsey McKay, former Assistant District Attorney for Travis County and founder and CEO of Respond Against Violence. Khara Breeden, the CEO of Texas Forensic Nurse Examiners. Tracy Matheson, President and founder of Project Beloved, the Molly Jane Mission. Lieutenant Shane Rigdon, Division Commander of Harris County Constable's Office, Human Trafficking Division. And Kristen Troken, Sexual Assault and Strangulation Survivor. I'm Tracy Shutt. I'm the founder of Voices for Change and a filmmaker. Welcome to this webinar, and thank you to this great group of panelists for joining us. We're going to start by talking a little bit about some of the problems with law enforcement's response to intimate partner violence and sexual assault. Kristen, you had a very traumatic experience with intimate partner violence in 2017. Could you tell us briefly what happened?
Sure. I was in a pretty new relationship, lasted just shy of a year. During that time, you could tell that as the relationship progressed, it was more manipulative, more psychologically abusive, and the real violent and predatory behaviors didn't start until the relationship was nearing its end. After the breakup, I went through 3.5 months of being stalked incessantly. Between August and November of 2017, there had been 7 different phone calls to the police for different situations. Each one were either ignored or not taken seriously, or I was told not to take it seriously. And it resulted in a situation where I was strangled and assaulted. I wouldn't wish that upon anyone.
Yeah. Talk to me a little bit more about how, when you called the police, you were discouraged about pursuing the case.
I find this fascinating, honestly. It was the first time he had strangled me. I had visible injuries on my neck, and I was told by the sergeant who was investigating the case who would refuse to talk to me and advise me to speak with her victim's counselor, and multiple calls, trying to get phone calls back, trying to at least understand what was going on. When I did finally have a conversation, I was just reminded and nudged that this would take a lot of time out of my life, many court settings that I would have to appear at, many conversations to have to relive this traumatic event. And am I really willing to go through all that? And it just really discouraged me and pushed me away from the entire process and painted this picture that I would have to bend over backwards in order to even have a chance at justice. And while you're trying to heal through a traumatic experience, the thought of just piling on more weight on your shoulders isn't something that really seems too appealing.
Right. So, and that conversation took place before you were sexually assaulted.
Yes, the first time I was strangled. And that was phone call number 4 to the police.
And so that kind of lack of response really impacted your ability to stay safe.
It's not just the lack of response. It's looking at the bigger picture overall. You have 7 different phone calls that were made to the police, and I didn't pick up the phone and call every single instance that I could. I mean, 3.5 months went by that I was being stalked and saw his car by my house every single day, and those instances weren't followed through with a call to the police. So you have to take into consideration that the escalating behavior and the severity in which prompted those phone calls were not really taken into consideration. When you're looking at the history and the timeline and how all these behaviors are escalating, it's not looked at. It's looked at as, oh, well, he broke your door down, but 3 weeks ago he used to live here, so therefore he could still be considered his residence. When you're looking at your ability to stay safe, you can't really plan ahead for something that A, you have no control over, and B, the institutions that are in place to keep you protected when you have no control are not taking you seriously or telling you to ignore it.
If you had to do this over again, do you think you would have made that first call to the police?
If I had to do it again, I think I would go straight to an advocacy support center, speak with an advocate first. Because if I look back at my entire experience, the only time I started to get true help, started to have a plan for safety, started to have a plan for healing is when I worked with advocacy. And I don't necessarily think that in the future, calling the police is going to lead towards anything that's positive. Because in my situation and experiences that I've heard from other women is now you're looking at a twofold situation where you have a woman who, or a man in domestic violence, but you have somebody who has been abused psychologically, physically, most likely over a long period of time. And that affects your psyche. That creates an internal dialogue that perpetuates trauma. And then you're looking on the other side of the spectrum of a person who has sociopathic behaviors that are now being confirmed. They're being validated. And it's a source of power for these people. So the lack of safety on both ends for the community, for the individuals, for the perpetrators who are now feeling justified with these behaviors is a mess. It's an overall mess, and we need to do something before it gets worse.
Kelsey, how common are Kristen's experiences in the criminal justice system?
Incredibly common. I mean, it is kind of the one thing that unless you have become part of the criminal justice system as a survivor, as a victim, or experience entering into what is the complex reality of the criminal legal system, you just don't know. This is not something we talk about a lot. And so it's important that people, I mean, I get calls daily from survivors who, by no fault of their own, have been pushed into the criminal system, mostly because we tell survivors of sexual assault, of domestic violence, of every type of crime, that what you do is you call the police and the police will help you. And the police can help you in some situations, but with domestic violence especially, where so many of our officers don't get the adequate training to understand the dynamics and the complexities, and that most often victims are just trying to survive. When we don't provide officers with enough training or tools, incorporate advocates, as you heard Kristen say, it was her connection with advocates that helped her navigate that. Victims really get very little support on navigating the criminal justice system for themselves. And so unfortunately, oftentimes they are either given messages that are conflicting. So I'm told to call the police, but then when I call the police, they tell me I don't really want to do this. And then the case, eventually might get dismissed and everyone just says, well, the victim didn't cooperate. And in other cases where the victim's path to survival is staying with the abuser, her resource for the information of what's occurring in the case is often the defendant. And obviously, these types of abusers are very manipulative. And what I see is that, without a doubt, domestic violence abusers, as well as some of our other serial offenders, like in human trafficking and sexual violence, they're really crafty and they're outsmarting our police officers. And so what I always try to do is encourage us to rethink our game and our approach, because we're being out manipulated by those perpetrators.
And ultimately, they're not being held accountable for their behaviors. And why is that important? Why is it important that perpetrators are held accountable?
Well, a few reasons. One, for victims, in order for victims to trust a system, our system must respond consistently and reliably. Because when victims know that the system can't and won't protect them, they're not going to reach out and engage in it. And then most importantly, when victim does reach out and ask for help, right, there's a whole history behind that. Often victims don't just call the police the first time something happens. So by the time it's gotten to the point that they're calling for help, something's really bad, especially in the case of domestic violence, something's gotten really bad. And when especially an abuser knows that the police have been contacted and then they don't do something about it, what has just happened is he has pushed a boundary. That perpetrator has now established that there's a boundary he can push. the police aren't going to do anything, or in some cases, the DA's office don't do anything if there's a violation of a bond or a protective order, and it goes kind of with a slap on the wrist. And so the message to abusers is, you can keep pushing. And the message to survivors is, and we won't do anything about it.
That's a tragic state of affairs, but it's not necessary. And it's important that we talk about the solutions. And there are some solutions that are being used right now in the great state of Texas. Tracy, you lost your daughter in 2017 when she was raped and strangled. Could you tell us a little bit about Molly Jane?
Molly Jane was light. She was everyone's best friend. She had a sense of humor that would make the stone coldest heart laugh. She was my best friend. I said that before she died. I know that after her death in a very real way. I called her my right hand. She was everything. She was one of 4 kids. She was the only daughter. She held that position, used it to her advantage when she could. But she was everything. Studying to be a social worker, was going to get out there and work with troubled youth, going to do good in the world.
You created a foundation in her name and now use those funds for a couple of initiatives. Can you tell us about those?
We started Project Beloved a year after Molly's death. We actually launched it on the 1-year anniversary. And our first initiative that we got started with are Beloved Bundles in a string backpack. And it has clothing and undergarments and hygiene products and flip-flops and a stress ball. Oftentimes when a victim goes for a forensic exam, their clothing must be taken as evidence. And so they might be left with nothing more than hospital scrubs to wear home. So we partner with rape crisis centers and SANE departments around the country, providing them with Beloved Bundles so that they can distribute these to victims and they can get dressed and showered and teeth brushed and hair washed and walk out of the hospital or away from the exam with the slightest amount of dignity.
It's so important. What we're talking about is addressing the trauma head on. And I think we need to do that in a bunch of different ways. You also developed soft interview rooms. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I can't take credit for developing them. I learned about them as I started studying sexual assault and trauma and its impact. And I learned about a trauma-informed response. And I learned that a soft interview room is considered a component, a piece of a trauma-informed response. And basically it's taking cold, stark, and sterile, which is generally the condition of most interview spaces at law enforcement agencies, and transforming it so that it is something much more like a living room space, something you might find in someone's home that's warm and inviting and comfortable. And it is one step toward being a trauma-informed response. And I just had this idea that there probably wasn't an agency in the country that has a budget to allow for the transformation of these spaces. And so basically Project Beloved just put it out into the atmosphere that we would create soft interview rooms. If you asked, that we would use our funds and we would take your space and give it a makeover. And we have basically had a steady stream of doing one room a month, sometimes more than one. All through 2020, we're on track in 21 to do at least that much again.
Are they all in Texas?
They're all over the country. Yeah, it's kind of exciting to see the recognition of the importance and the need for this kind of an environment. We're asking these victims to come in and talk about something that it's the last thing they want to talk about.
Kristen, how does that kind of contrast to your experience?
I have in the past referenced my SANE exam to what it was like going into a C-section, where you are alone in a room on a cold table. It is stark and sterile, and you are just waiting for somebody to come and do their job, whether that is give you a spinal tap or turn on their tape recorder and ask you questions. I did not enjoy my interview experience whatsoever. It's drastically different.
Khara, you've taken the idea of soft interview rooms several steps farther. You're a nurse. You've provided and have trained nurses to provide sane sexual assault nurse exams since 2011. Tell us about this work and how it grew into the forensic adult interviews that you're doing.
I became a forensic nurse in 2011, and I was working at our county hospital here in Houston, who have a wonderful program, but we were frequently getting patients who had been to 3 and 4 and 5 hospitals before they arrived to us. And I just always felt in that moment that there had to be a better way for these victims to be taken care of when we're talking about something that really should be a basic human right. They should be able to go into their local community hospital and be able to get a medical forensic exam from a trained nurse. So I didn't know what that was going to look like at the time. And so March of 2019, Texas Forensic Nurse Examiners was launched. We began seeing patients. And what that has turned into is us partnering with hospitals and clinics and women's centers agencies throughout Harris and really 11 counties that surround us at this point. And today, as we sit here and have this conversation, we respond to 48 locations throughout 11 counties that surround Harris County. And so that means that victims don't get turned away. They don't have to travel long distances to get an exam. That communities, we work really closely with our community partners and law enforcement and DA's offices so that they can refer patients to the right places so that they go to the right place the first time and get quality care that is really able to help them in that moment. In June of 2020, we did launch an adult forensic interviewing program. And so those are totally separate. We have trained forensic interviewers that have a background in victim services. The interviewers we have working here now have previously been advocates. So they really understand working with victims of trauma and what that looks like and know how to have those really crucial and important conversations about their experiences in a very safe way.
So how does an adult forensic interview differ from how a police might interview a victim?
So I'd like to say that it's very different, but it's done in collaboration with law enforcement. So again, we have always felt like we cannot do this work alone, that our partners are the most important aspect of us doing our job well. And so we have really worked hard, or our interviewers have worked hard at building our relationships with law enforcement, like Lieutenant Rigdon. And he refers victims to our forensic interviewing program. They'll come in, they sit in a very safe, very comfortable space, very similar to Tracy's space. And they'll do the interview for law enforcement, but law enforcement is really helping guide that interview. The interviewer and law enforcement are having a conversation about what information they're needing. They're really working hand in hand, but they're making sure that that victim feels safe in that space while that's being done.
You also offer some other services to victims, is that correct?
Right. So as we've we launched in 2 years ago, we just had our birthday, and along the path, we've seen these other gaps in service. So the forensic interviewing being a big one. But the other things, we've had advocates since the day we started. As Kristen said, advocates are just so important in the work we do. They're really the glue that holds all the other stuff that's going on together. So they've been with us since day one. But the other things that we've noticed that we have added since then is a counseling program. We were finding that our victims were having significantly long wait times to try to get involved into counseling. And we felt like victims should be able to get into counseling when they felt like they were able to do that. So we wanted to make sure there wasn't a gap in when they could start that process. And then the other thing that we've added is we have an attorney on staff, which is really nice to help with protective orders and help through guiding through the legal process and things like that. So as we find gaps to help make the experience better for victims, we add services as they're needed.
So how long do you stay with your clients I mean, will they stick with you for a while, or do you is it kind of an emergency response and then they transition to other services?
So far, we're not transitioning anybody out as far as counseling. As far as our advocacy services, we do definitely, our work is always, again, to collaborate with our partners. So our advocates always are connecting into other victim service centers. So we always have the goal of putting them back into their community, making sure that they have services close to them that are available.
So it seems like such a no-brainer what you're talking about, and that it should have been going on forever, and that everybody should have these services. What are some of your plans for expansion?
Well, we have really tried to create this organization to where it could be, duplicated or even expanded in other areas very easily. We have talked to several areas in the Texas area about expanding, just actually having satellite locations. So I don't know what the future will hold, but I know that there's definitely a need and a lot of interest. So I guess we'll have to wait and see how that turns out.
Kristen, I think you told me that you did have some interaction with SANE nurses during your experience, and that was your only good experience.
I did. Yes. So I went to a satellite location to be examined, and it was in a center that was specifically for women of domestic violence, women who are seeking shelter to protect themselves from bad situations. And so I'm not sure if that really played a role into their handling, but it was to the point, of course, I was still uncomfortable. I was vulnerable. You are being asked very personal questions, and I couldn't say I felt comfortable because nobody really would in that situation, but I felt safe, if that is an easy way to put it. And it was because strangulation was involved. The SANE nurse recommended that I do go to the hospital afterwards for follow-up work because of internal damaging that could be done, that could be problematic even days later. And the tone, the seriousness, even the way I was accepted was starkly different between the hospital doctor versus the SANE nurse.
So Lieutenant Rigdon, you're the division commander of a precinct that deals with human trafficking in Harris County in Houston. Tell us a little bit about that work.
I started approximately 2.5 years ago. It's been an eye-opener for me. One thing, we changed the whole way I look at things because I've learned something that these sex trafficking victims is I do not believe that they're there by choice, whether it's drugs, manipulations, whether they're coerced. They did not make a conscious decision to stay in this environment and continue to suffer the abuse. I've always invited someone to prove me otherwise, but I've yet to see any evidence that supports that. I just think, so what I've realized is these victims, society has turned their back on them as well. Their parents sometimes turn their back on them. They have no one to turn to. So when we do come in contact with them, I ask my team to change how they look at things and offer those victims a sense of hope. And that's what we got to do, is be the hope for that victim and get them to right resources, get them to the right people. We can't do it all. We can start the process. And what we've done is have all of our investigators are trauma-informed, victim-centered as far as take that approach. And they're all trauma-informed trained as far as interviewing techniques. They realize that they're not an advocate. They're not a social worker, but they need those other avenues in order to us to effectively go after and help this victim. Ultimate goal, yes, we'd like to prosecute the trafficker, but the first priority is always getting this victim help. And that's how we carry ourselves. And our motto is we're going to give them, if there's all we have is 15 minutes, we're giving them 15 minutes of hope.
How does that make a difference in terms of the outcomes of the cases? How does a trauma-informed approach change the outcomes?
Well, and listen to Kristen's story. Kind of it irks me that it was happened to her, because when we are there, we're lost time. We're the first responder to something. You're the first in line. It's our job to be compassionate, and by having that attitude, by having that the victim realizes that you are there to help and you're not just there to come in and you're just there just a case or just another number, or you're ready to get off your shift and you want to go, they open up with you a little bit. You earn their trust. And it doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't have, we sometimes we take multiple meetings. In cases with these trafficking victims, just because they make an outcry, that's just the beginning. We have to continue to maintain that relationship with them and maintain that sense of hope by getting them to the right resources or doing what we can, showing them that we care.
Does this end up translating into an increased rate of prosecution of these cases?
Absolutely. Because we actually, by using the different in advocacy, by using Texas F&E, going to a forensic interview, a lot of times we have their stories, and we never interview anybody, by the way. None of my victims are ever interviewed. We ask them to tell us their story. And that's something I want to stress my investigators. Don't interview them, have them tell you your story, or tell them their story. Their stories are cooperated with these interviews, but these interviews are a different environment. If we encounter someone on the side of the road, that's not a conducive environment for a victim to open up to us. They're wondering who's watching them. Is there a trafficker around them, or is the person that assaulted them around them? We have to get them to a safe, comfortable place around someone else that makes them feel safe as well. Yes, we're law enforcement. We're going to try to make them feel safe, but we still have that stigma of, yes, you're the big guy in the uniform with the gun, or a lot of times we're plainclothes, but you wear a badge. They're scared. But if we get them to someone who has a different tone of voice, who gets them a conducive environment where they're relaxed, they're going to be able to open up and tell their story.
You're law enforcement. You're not social workers. You're not nurses. But do we really think that police officers could all be learning some of these skills? What do we want the average patrol officer to know?
I personally think every single patrol officer in the state of Texas should be trauma-informed or take some type of trauma-informed interviewing class. I really think it does. I just think we're there a lot of times. You may roll up on something. You get the calls. You're the first one there. So you need to get rid of this, I'm the police, the attitude, because we are control. You do have to control situations, but sometimes it's okay to come in there and say, you know what? I have compassion and I care and I'm here to help. That's what we all should have got this business to do.
So we don't expect all law enforcement to become experts in victimology and trauma, but we'd like them to learn to communicate in a way with victims that doesn't re-traumatize them, right? So how does this conversation relate to the concept of defunding?
I realize there's two avenues or two thoughts of defunding. And the ideal, yes, we do need to work hand in hand. We do. My office, I will be honest, we have resources. We're fortunate that I have a victims advocate who's been there, done that, who's Kathy Griffin that works with me. She's a former prosecutor that spends her whole life coming out to help. She's a phone call away to be with our victims anytime we need them. But I can't do this job without the help of that, because most of us, if we do have a degree, it's in criminal justice. I have a degree in humanities, but nowhere am I near a licensed social worker. So it's imperative that we build these partnerships, because with the partnerships with Texas F&E, with the advocacy, with the counselors, we all want the common goal, and that's to help the victim. And with that, it helps us build a case to where we can get that the suspect or the trafficker who continues to hurt victims and will actually prey on other victims. We can go after them.
Kelsey, it's pretty clear that the criminal justice system needs to change how it approaches cases of domestic violence, particularly sexual assault and human trafficking. And as we've spoken before, we don't really see those as three separate siloed events. They're all about they're all gender-based violence. So what are some of the immediate steps that you think police departments should be taking to make this situation better for victims?
Well, first and foremost, we have to start having conversations with each other, because the term defunding has become incredibly polarizing. And I very much respect law enforcement. I work very closely with law enforcement. I was on call for law enforcement for 7 years, 24 hours a day. Many of my best friends are police officers. And what I find is that we put so much responsibility on them to be an expert in so many different things: mental health, suicide, alcoholism, and so often their job is, their life is on the line. Someone else's life is on the line. And so I agree with the lieutenant that without a doubt, we need to teach them victimology and trauma-informed approaches. But in the end, we can't ask them to do something that is entirely out of their spectrum. We have to have community partners who can really have the baton passed to them, because law enforcement is asked to wear way too many hats, and then they get criticized when they don't wear it well. And so we really need to focus on patrol officers passing the baton to something like an adult forensic interview, where a trained social worker can sit and have a conversation. I have so many victims who tell me, the detective came out and interviewed me about my sexual assault in the hallway, in the waiting room, and, these environments that are not conducive to it. So that's why having soft interview rooms are amazing. But what we need to do, in addition to improving the environment, the physical environment, is we need to change how we have those conversations and how we get evidence. So often law enforcement will identify probable cause. So a patrol officer will get just enough to file probable cause. And then the expectation is the detective will follow up with that. Well, unfortunately, in so many of these types of cases, anything involving interpersonal violence, often that victim has renegotiated and rethought through their safety concerns and what are the consequences that are going to come from her cooperating with law enforcement. And so by 2 days later, when the detective might reach out, it's too late. And so if we can provide a way for victims to tell their story in a trauma-informed environment, in a trauma-informed way, like the adult forensic interviews, I am telling you, things change overnight. I am part of the team working to create those protocols. I have watched many of the adult forensic interviews, and it is the key to the future. And law enforcement still has a say in that. They're watching the interviews, they're informing. It's a teamwork model. And the other thing I find is that with going back to the medical forensic exams, in most states, and certainly in Texas, we don't cover medical forensic exams for anything other than sexual assault. So if a human trafficking survivor, domestic violence victim has been strangled but not sexually assaulted, or they don't want to report the sexual assault part, they don't have access in most places to a medical forensic exam. So one of the really important things that Khara's team did was they do exams outside of sexual assault. They do strangulation exams, and they fund it, and there's not a burden to the victim. And so both of these things are things that you can make happen pretty quickly. You heard Khara say we just started the interviews in June, and Khara, I think we're up to 300, maybe even more. I got to tell you, I watch them every day, and it's unbelievable how the victims, how often they're like, oh, this is so pretty, or like, this is so nice that you guys are doing it. It's entirely different than Kristen's experience and so many victims that I've worked with in the past who really are pushed away from the system when they go into that initial interview. So just thinking outside of the box, doing things. These are some of my favorite programs. That's why I brought all these people into this webinar, because it's without a doubt a model that we need to expand. And as a former prosecutor, one of my big challenges in domestic violence and sexual assault cases was often that the defenses and the beyond the reasonable doubt burden wasn't considered. And so one of the suggestions I made when they were putting together the AFI program is it's wonderful that there's a police officer there, but really we need prosecutors involved so that we can prepare against defenses and prepare these cases to have the elements that we need to have admissible evidence, even if the victim doesn't cooperate. And so it's been a really wonderful project to work together with the advocates, the nurses, other prosecutors, and certainly with police officers. And I think that's given them a sigh of relief that they don't have to sit in a room with a victim and talk about a sexual experience that everyone's uncomfortable talking about. So we have some wonderful forensic interviewers, and we look forward to expanding that program throughout Texas and hopefully nationally.
Are there changes that need to be made at the state and federal level to facilitate this?
Funding and evidence-based approaches. So unfortunately, a lot of legislation will pass without the second phase of implementation. So a great example is last legislative session, they mandated that law enforcement officers get trained on strangulation. But there was no money to go with it. So it can't really be enforced. Now, outside of the government, we have come up with solutions. We just launched a roll call series, 6 8-minute videos that all officers can have access to for free in Texas, that will educate them at the beginning of a shift how to investigate those cases. And so it's not just passing legislation. It's about how do we roll out the implementation. And, Tracy has experience with that, having passed a law last legislative session, Molly Jane's law. But it really is about seeing it through, not just the political, wins, like, oh, we made this law. It's actually creating the implementation program, the getting the forensic exams, doing the forensic interviews, and then self-auditing that situation. We're constantly looking and saying, okay, how could we have done that different? How should we approach that? And looking to people like our police officers and other experts to help guide that conversation so that the results and the programs that we create are evidence-based.
So, Tracy, talk to us a little bit about Molly Jane's law. I understand that Molly Jane's murder was known to law enforcement. Tell me how Molly Jane's law is working to prevent serial perpetrators from reoffending.
The statistics show that there is a very likelihood that rapists are going to rape again and again and again. And so we learned that the person who has been indicted in our case is someone who was known to multiple jurisdictions for raping and strangling women. And so Molly Jane's law is sort of in response to, okay, so how could we address that? And there is something known as VICAP, which is Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. It is run and administered by the FBI. It is available in all 50 states, and it is free to use. And Molly Jane's law states that when law enforcement investigates a case of sexual assault, they shall use VICAP and put the case into VICAP. It's a behavioral-based database, and it basically helps to connect dots between offenders, between offenses. It allows law enforcement across the state of Texas to be in communication with each other, because that's not something that just happens organically. So that if you have a case in Dallas, Texas, and you go to VICAP and put it in, and then someone in Amarillo puts a case in, and maybe the offender's name matches, maybe the MO is the same, well, then those two agencies can be in contact with each other and, compare notes and hopefully be able to act decisively, taking the offender off the street before they rape again or before their pattern escalates.
You've taken such a tragic experience and have done so much wonderful advocacy on behalf of Molly Jane and other victims. I'm just so overwhelmed by the generosity of spirit that you have. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Kristen, one more question for you. Hearing all of this, how would having a trauma-informed response changed your experience?
Realistically, if you were to take a trauma-informed response to the first or second phone call I made to the police, I don't think I would be standing here today and telling you guys that I'm a survivor of strangulation and sexual assault. If they would have taken it seriously and taken a trauma-informed response from the beginning, I don't think it would have ever escalated to where it is, where it had become.
So a trauma-informed response is not just about making victims feel better. It's also really about preventing crime. And I think that that's a really important thing for everybody to hear. It's not just a touchy-feely, let's take care of survivors and victims. Let's prevent crimes from happening, right? Okay, so we called this webinar Beyond Defunding, right? We did that to raise awareness of some of the tools and services that are available that would help police do a better job of responding to intimate partner violence.
I feel bad that it's been a polarizing conversation. I feel bad that any officer has interpreted that. Well, and sometimes rightfully so. There are a group of folks who that is the goal, to defund police. The challenge with that and the fear of that is that we have to change that conversation, because otherwise it's us versus them. And I have talked to a lot of my law enforcement friends and heard about how it's negatively impacted them. And while it's not up to me to change the name of any kind of movement, I do think the point is that we have to start leaning on each other and our community partners and recognize that the expectations we have set for police officers in many cases are unreasonable. And I'm not talking about police officers who commit crimes and kill people and need to be held accountable, but I know so many incredible police officers that we have to learn to support them in a different way. Let them do the part of their job that they are really good at, and make sure that they know where to refer a survivor, what the next step in that chain is. And this is both with respect to their mental health and their medical health. In Austin, I think one of the crowning achievements after we not only trained our officers on investigating strangulation and we gave them the guidance of something like a strangulation supplement is when they mandated the dispatch of an ambulance to every single strangulation case. That without a doubt was a turning point because now not only did survivors have officers who knew what questions to ask them at the crime scene, but they were then connected to that next step, which was taking care of their medical and physical health. And then obviously coupling that with working with our forensic nurses and working with our advocates, I say at least on a daily basis, everything I ever learned, I learned from an advocate. And I'm thankful for my relationships with advocates throughout my experience as a prosecutor. And I encourage everyone to lean on advocates because they have spoken to so many survivors. And instead of us telling survivors what they need, we really must meet them where they're at. And it really has been incredible to watch how survivors have responded to these forensic interviews and what a difference it is for them to go through a system that doesn't re-traumatize them. It's never going to be fun to go through the criminal justice system as a victim or as a survivor. We're always going to drop the ball in some places, but our goal needs to be to not make it worse than the event or the crime or the assault that they experienced that got them there. And unfortunately, that is what I see with so many survivors. And it's not just law enforcement that needs this lens. It's prosecutors as well. I know I couldn't even count on one hand how many times I was not trauma informed. And so really shifting how we talk about these cases and understanding that victims are not always going to be in a place where they can accommodate our needs. So instead of having them come to the station to give a statement, let's come up with other ways. What do you need to help you get here? Do you need food? Do you need gas money? Do you have childcare? And recognizing we can't ask victims to investigate and prosecute their own cases. We have to give them some guidance along the way. There's a lot of people who do trauma-informed interviewing, and most of you should not be surprised to find out that there are probably advocates in your own community who will come and do that training and probably do it for free. There are other opportunities. We're working towards creating some curriculum and training on the adult forensic interviewing program. Even if your community is not in a place where they're ready to adopt the actual programs and incorporate social workers as the interviewers, our hope is to be able to train everyone from prosecutors and law enforcement and advocates so that they can incorporate our approach to doing those adult forensic interviews in their own meetings, because obviously you're still going to have to meet with a prosecutor and there might be some follow-up. And so we want everyone to understand that model. And I think they're all going to be surprised about how easy it is to actually do it. We've put a lot of thought and consideration into the curriculum so that it is non-biased, so that it is neutral, so that it is really a conversation, not an interrogation, which is how so many survivors describe to me their experience with law enforcement and prosecutors.
Kelsey has been working with us very closely on the curriculum. We do hope to launch our first course this summer. So anyone on here that's interested in that can certainly sign up for our email on our website. And as soon as we get finalized dates, then that announcement will go out.
If you sign up or follow me on LinkedIn, I try to post those things, especially when it's something that's going to be free and open to other people. You can also reach out to me for training, and we can develop something specifically for you.
So I want to thank you, each of the panelists, for the work that you're doing to prevent gender-based violence. And thank you to the audience for tuning in and being a voice for change. Voices for Change is a grassroots organization committed to elevating the voices of survivors of intimate partner abuse and providing educational content. Our vision is a world where gender-based violence is no longer tolerated. Learn more about how you can help at voicesforchange.net.